As a member of the House Financial Services Committee in 2009, Congressman William Lacy Clay Jr. helped to bypass an Obama administration proposal requiring that the financial services industry have the best interests of their clients in mind. Now, that decision is coming back to haunt him in a race against challenger Cori Bush, who you've seen here on this show.
Fight Corporate Monopolies, a progressive advocacy group, released an ad this week blasting Clay for the campaign cash he received from Wall Street donors. Take a listen.
When predatory Wall Street firms needed a favor, they turned to Congressman William Lacy Clay. Clay opposed President Obama's effort to protect working families' retirement savings from greedy financiers, instead joining with Wall Street. What did Clay get for opposing Obama and siding with Trump? Tens of thousands of dollars in campaign contributions. Corporate power is corrupting democracy, and William Lacy Clay is part of the problem. Fight Corporate Monopolies is responsible for the content of this ad.
Wow.
All right, here to tell us more is D.C. Bureau Chief of the Intercept and great friend of the show, Ryan Graham. Great to see you, Ryan.
Good to see you, Ryan.
See you.
All right, give us the substance of what this ad is about, and also give us a little bird's eye view of the strategy here.
Right. It's brutal in the sense that it pins Lacy Clay, against Barack Obama. Barack Obama, the second most popular Democrat in the world after his wife, and so being on the other side of him and being allied with President Donald Trump in a Democratic primary is just brutal. And what makes it even more brutal is that it's true in this case. So the rule that they're talking about there is called either the fiduciary rule or the conflict of interest rule. And it's utterly bizarre that it even had to be enacted. The rule says that if you're a financial advisor, you have to have the best interests of your client at heart. In other words, you can't push your client into some crappy product that your own company made that's just going to bilk them for fees. That's what much of the investment industry does for workers who don't have the power to choose between different investment plans. The employer picks the plan for them. The investment advisors give a little kickback to the employer, say this is the best one for you to take. You're going to get a great rate, and it's the workers who wind up with the short end of the stick. And so the Obama administration, as part of Wall Street reform, was put into place a rule that said you can't have these conflicts of interest. That unleashed a 6-year war where the investment industry pushed back. And one of the people who was a leading spear in that fight was Lacy Clay, who has a key position on the House Financial Services Committee and joined with Republicans in pushing back against this rule. And to have somebody like Clay on letters and in efforts pushing back against the rule, gave it a sheen of bipartisanship. Say, you know what? Actually, we're just looking out for working people here. Otherwise, you wouldn't have Democrats on the bill. Now, after Trump took office, he came in and said, hey, these Democrats were right. And he obliterated the rule. So the rule is now gone. Lacy Clay has now switched sides and said that's terrible what Trump did. But he spent 6 years fighting the Obama administration's attempt to enact the rule. And it was the fact that it took so long that enabled the Trump administration to overturn the rule.
And Ryan, outline this here, which is, and we talked about this previously, which is that this is a real shot across the bow at the House Democratic Caucus. These are ads with real money behind them that are calling them out for corporatism over decades. What is this how is this reverberating on the national Democratic level?
It's going to shock the House Democratic Caucus because the ecosystem, as people understood it, was that you could do things like this in Washington, and it wasn't going to turn up as news back in Springfield, Massachusetts, or St. Louis, Missouri. All he did, he signed a couple of letters that were written to the Department of Labor, which kind of lends credibility to the effort. But it wasn't like he was going to public war and going on cable and attacking President Obama. And so the kind of unwritten rule was that sort of thing stays in Washington. But now you have this deep-pocketed kind of dark money progressive group that's fighting corporate monopolies. They're dumping 6 figures into St. Louis to tell everybody what he did when he was in Washington, breaking that unwritten rule. This is the same group that's doing the same thing in Springfield, Massachusetts, to Richie Neal, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. Richie Neal took a ton of money from private equity firms that own shares in hospital companies and in kind of in hospital networks, and fought against surprise billing reform. That thing where you show up in a hospital and one of the doctors that sees you while you're in the hospital is not in your network, and boom, you've got a $25,000 bill when you didn't have. It's not like you had a choice. You couldn't ask the doctor as he's coming in with a clipboard, what network he's in and if he's out of network. So he raked in tons of money, and he's getting hammered back home with big money. This changes the game. Somebody like Cori Bush, she lost by 20 points in 2018. She's running a much stronger campaign. Clay is obviously still the favorite. Any incumbent is a favorite. The Clay family has held this seat for 52 years, but to have air power like this coming in has to make Clay nervous.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that's a big part of the dynamic is not just was there an unwritten rule that you could do this stuff in D.C. and it wouldn't catch wind back home. The reason that rule was there is because there was no money behind any anti-corporate forces to tell that story back home. So speak to that dynamic of how the fact that there's real money here to push for anti-monopoly, anti-corporate, or as sort of what most Americans would actually want, a more balanced economy. Right. Talk about how that changes the dynamic as well.
Yeah, I think there are two things going on here, and one of them is that the left has actually seen some success. So people who have money say, oh, actually, if I invest in candidates like an Ocasio-Cortez, they might actually win. The second piece of what's going on, I think, is actually a function of inequality. We have this lottery-like capitalist system that has been operating 30 or 40 years now, since the 1980s. And because it's a lottery system, based on luck, you're going to accidentally enrich a small percentage of decent people, who have kind of progressive or populist values. All of a sudden, they turn out to be, multimillionaires. And they don't want anything other than upsetting the apple cart. They want to destroy the system that kind of turned them into these multimillionaires. That's not 99% of the people that the system works for, but if you have 1% of those, and there are 2,000 of them, let's say across the country, that starts to add up to real money. If all you need is $300,000 in Springfield to overturn a Ways and Means chairman, for instance.
Mm-hmm. So tell us about just the state of the race here, Ryan. How are Cori Bush's chances looking? What does the polling look like, and is this going to make a difference?
So there was polling that I've heard of that was done by Demand for Progress that had Lacy Clay under 50%, which means he's vulnerable. Still had Bush trailing by double digits. The difference between this time and 2018 is that in 2018, the entirety of Bush's paid campaign operation, paid messaging operation was basically 2 weeks of radio ads. This time, she's going to be on radio for about 8 weeks. She's up on television with her own ad buy on top of the one that we're seeing here. A Sunrise Movement just endorsed her and is going to raise money for her, and their outside spending arm might spend on her behalf. She's been able to spend $85,000 on mailers so far. And so losing by 20 points in 2018 shows that she's an underdog, but many of the people that came out to vote in 2018 simply didn't know who she is. And that it's an underrated fact of American politics that just simple name ID plays such a significant role. Pundits on the national stage say, well, clearly voters rejected Medicare for all, and therefore that's why Cori Bush lost. If you talk to voters, they'd say, actually, I supported all of the things that Bush was for. I just hadn't actually heard of her. And under pressure, Lacy Clay now is actually a sponsor of Medicare for All, which is another thing that has muddied the waters of these primaries. Because if you just kind of check a lot of boxes in these deep blue seats, the incumbents, have usually sponsored all of the right bills and appear outwardly progressive. So you kind of need a significant amount of money to start explaining to people, okay, yes, that's true, but here's what he did on the conflict of interest rule.
That's a smart point.
And finally, Ryan, your imprint has a new book coming out written by Elise Hogue. Give our viewers a little bit of a preview of that.
Yeah, fresh off our smashing success. We're two best-selling authors of the Populist Guides of 2020. Our next book coming out, Elise Hogue, It's based on years of research from NARAL's research department, and it's a history that runs through how we got to where we are when it comes to both the men's rights movement, the Trump administration, all of it going back to the fight around abortion politics in the 1970s. It's eye-opening. Back in the 1970s, abortion was not a terribly controversial issue. People think that Roe v. Wade really set off this national debate that led to where we are today, but that's simply not true. 5 years after Roe v. Wade, it still wasn't that salient an issue. It actually came about as kind of a replacement cultural issue for school desegregation. Once school desegregation was not something that you could publicly organize people around on the right, they needed a new cultural touchstone, and they hit on abortion as the issue, and turned it into what it is today. It's a really fascinating history. No matter what side of the question you're on, I think you'd learn a lot from it. And it's called The Lie That Binds. It'll be out tomorrow.
Well, that's certainly going to be interesting. I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Ryan. Appreciate it.
Thanks,
I think
Ryan.
you'll like it, Sagar.
All right. Next on Rising, the Lincoln Project's videos attacking President Trump are getting a lot of attention by the mainstream media. But what is their actual motive? Author J.D. Vance, he joins us next to discuss the Lincoln Project's agenda, but also the future of the right when we continue.